Right, so anyone who's watching this video can kind of tell I'm not usually the kind of guy who makes YouTube videos or documents stuff like this, but this is quite an interesting project of mine, and I thought it'd be a good idea if people knew about, the process that went into it, specifically for like the Gorn modding community or any other aspiring programmers out there. So, and for the record, if you cannot tell, this video will contain like kind of technical talk, some code talk, and if you're not really interested in dumb shit like that, then I'm just kind of just advising you now. I don't know why you click on the video otherwise. So Gorn is a virtual reality game on Steam, and you play as a gladiator in a pit, and you go fight other gladiators and hit each other and kill each other, and it's pretty damn fun. As a modder, and other modders, we kind of wanted to take this a bit further and add our own content to the game. We finally managed to start adding in custom levels only very recently, but we kind of ran into this like small pitfall like straight away as soon as it happened. And that is the problem that the enemies aren't very good at tracking you or getting to in any way, shape or form. So as you can see, the enemies are kind of a bit brain dead. All they do is walk in a straight line towards you, regardless of what's in between you and them, which means that, if you have a custom level where there's a pit, they'll just walk directly into the pit trying to get to you. This wasn't a problem on the original game, just because the original game had big open maps that didn't have any obstacles. So knowing that custom levels would be kind of dead on arrival without proper pathfinding, because everyone's level would be just an open field, I decided to actually implement proper pathfinding into the enemies. In order to get started, we kind of need more context as to how modding exists and how it works in the context of Gorn. So Gorn is a game made in Unity, and Unity is a game engine that other people use to make games, of course. I'm not going to go too far into it, but what it basically means is that when we're modding, we have all the tools and technologies that come with Unity as a whole, and we can inject them into the game whenever we feel like. And ever so conveniently, Unity comes with a pathfinding algorithm and a nav mesh system. I know those words are completely meaningless to most of you, but all you really need to know is that what we want to accomplish is completely doable with Unity by itself without me having to export and import, extra libraries and extra tools. So I guess one of the core problems we have straight away is the fact that, the enemies don't know what's in front of them. They can't see walls, they can't see obstacles. So this is what the nav mesh is for. A nav mesh is like this kind of layer that goes on top of your level and tells the world what can be walked on and what can't be walked on. So, And then from there, creating a path between any 2 points on the nav mesh is actually really easy, and Unity kind of automatically does it for you. Now that we know this, we can kind of put together a little to-do list. So for a start, we need to bring out the nav mesh into Gorn so that, the game can create a path between two things. Then we need to plug that path into the enemy so the enemies stop following that instead of following the player. So the first problem we need to solve above all is the fact that there's no nav mesh loaded with most of the custom levels as soon as you open up the game, and this is because many map makers and even the vanilla game itself they just don't come with nav meshes. In fact, the way the maps are loaded into the game means that even if we wanted to tell map makers to include nav meshes, we wouldn't be able to. That's something you're going to have to ask the guy who made the level loader for Gorn, because it's not really my business, but I'll work with what I've got. So is there a way we can build/bake the nav mesh at runtime? As it turns out, you can. So natively, Unity doesn't actually have the ability to build nav meshes during runtime because, but Unity does have some extra tools that are not included by default, and if we import them, which we said we'd avoid doing, then we can try and build the nav mesh as soon as the level loads. So I tried to do this for a really long time. I kept trying to prompt the extra tool to build the nav mesh for us, and I was testing whether the path was buildable, stuff like that. And then as it turns out, the tool just didn't work at all, and Unity dropped support for it, which is probably why it was never included with Unity to begin with. So in order to get around this, of course, I went to Google, and as it turns out, someone out there had run into the same problem I had and had written some kind of shoddy script that would build a nav mesh for us, and I thought, might as well use it. So we've seemed to run into this weird problem where, because there's like a gate in the middle of the level before the game starts, the nav mesh builds and then takes that gate into mind when it builds. So it creates like this divide in the map where none of the enemies can cross it. So in the end, I had to wait until the gate had lowered before building the nav mesh, except it kind of led to this small problem where the gate would lower, you're in game already, and then the entire game would lag up because of trying to build the nav mesh. At this point, I spent I don't even know how many hours just getting the nav mesh to build to begin with, so I was like, fuck it, it works. Let me move on and try and get the enemies to follow it. So this is the point where we really start interfering with the game's currently inbuilt logic, considering we're basically going to override it and tell it to do what we want it to do instead of what it's currently doing. So in order to actually see what the logic of the enemies was, I had to decompile the game using tools like DNSpy. And basically what that means is I could see a raw kind of logical version of how the enemies are working and what kind of variables are used and what methods are called. Of course, this is really rough because stuff like local variables are called not very useful things, and there's no commenting or anything like that, so piecing things together from this isn't actually the best way to do it. So what I ended up seeing inside the enemy AI was the fact that there was a target object and a move point, and what I assumed is that these two would be the same thing, and that the enemy would constantly be walking in a straight line towards the target and the move point. So great, all I need to do is move that target/move point to the points on the path that I've been given, and therefore the enemies can move along it, right? Nope. Programming is never that easy, and frankly, I'm a fool for expecting it to work that way. But basically, the enemies weren't really cooperating. I was setting their points, and the path just wasn't working out whatsoever. So keep in mind, I'm not actually working in a decent testing environment or development environment. I'm just kind of writing some code, starting up the retail game as is, and just hoping it works. The most I have for a debug log is some mod someone else made that sends the debug log to a web server. But I did realize I could kind of create my own debug by drawing lines for where the enemy path was. So that's what I did. So if the enemy could find a path from where they are to the player, then it would draw that line on the floor, and that way in the game I could see it. And what I immediately noticed is that the enemies were never updating the path from where they first spawned. So what the problem ended up being is the fact that the enemies use rigid bodies to determine their position rather than the actual game objects that define them. That probably doesn't actually mean much to you, but all you really need to know in layman's terms is that I was getting the spawning point of the enemy rather than where the enemy actually was. So that wasn't really listed for me to find out until I kind of debugged it. So finally, after amending that, I finally managed to get the enemies to be properly determining the path that they need to take to get to the player. But again, because nothing is ever as easy as should be, there was another problem. So at essence, what I was doing was with the nav mesh, giving the nav mesh where the player was, where the enemy was, and then telling the enemy to go from the enemy to the player, which makes sense, right? The path would basically exist as a big list of points that the enemy has to walk to and from in a straight line in order to reach the player. So what I do is tell them, go to the first point in that path. And then once you reach that point, re-update the path so the first point then becomes something else. And it could just continue going to the first point until it sees the player, in which case it would go directly to the player. See, when the enemies get close enough to what they think the player is, they'll start fighting it. So what would happen is that they'd walk towards the first point in the path, they'd get almost there, just not quite close enough, and then they'd start punching the thin air because they thought that's where the player was, and then that way the path would never update and they'd never try to go to a new point. Well, I started to try and throw out some mad vector math, trying to make the enemies overshoot the point so that they calculate it properly and not start fighting the thin air. But it ended up turning out that I'd misread what the two things that I mentioned earlier did. So move point and target ended up being two different things. So target, of course, is the player, what you want the enemy to fight. Move point is actually something used in a move to state. To break it down, whenever the enemies would come out of the gate when they spawn, they'd move into the arena before they'd start fighting the player. And essentially the move point was to tell them that you should move to here before you start fighting the player, because otherwise, you're going to get stuck outside of the arena. At this moment, everything made sense. All I needed to do now is to hook onto that move point, switch the enemy's state into the move to state, and that way I could direct them to move to any point I wanted, and they wouldn't start fighting in thin air. So after making all those fixes, the damn thing actually worked. The enemies finally started computing a path between them and the player and started following those paths properly. There were still some bugs in the end, but I kind of thought I needed to get this out before maps die on us. Yeah, so if you didn't notice, the pathfinding kind of doesn't work on the vanilla maps just because of the way the nav mesh builds with the gates closed, so then the enemies just can't get outside the gates. But that is a problem to fix in another day in another video. Overall, I hope this video was kind of informative in showing what kind of things go into making a mod, and I hope that you guys find it at least slightly interesting. I mean, if you have any feedback for me or you want to tell me this completely fucking sucked, then go ahead, let me know. I'm not going to ask for likes or subscribers or any dumb shit like that because I really don't make videos nearly enough to kind of ask for that shit. So, hope you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks.